Hello, everybody. My name is Marina Pierri, and I am extremely proud and honored to be with the great writer Madeline Miller. In Italy, Sonzogno, Marsilio have already published their books, The Song of Achilles, Circe, and Galatea. Hello, Madeline. How are you?
Hello, I'm so honored to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, first of all, as a big fan of yours, I would like to ask you about the Song of Achilles, which has been winning the Italian audiences over for over 3 years. So I would like to ask, what do you think? Why do you think there is such a fascination with the rewriting of the myth?
I mean, for me, so many of these stories are so incredibly resonant. And of course, they happen 2,000, 3,000 years in the past, and things have changed, culture has changed, technology has changed. But so much of human emotion and human feeling is the same. We still fall in love and get angry and we grieve. And all of these life experiences are depicted so powerfully in the original myths and the stories. And so I think that, for one thing, these stories are not old. I think they're always new and always fresh. And what I love is when I read the ancient authors or I read the ancient myths, it feels like I'm reading something from right now. And so I love retellings because it's a way to sort of create that bridge to, retell the stories for a new audience, but also to sort of animate them with new life. And that's a very old thing to do, that, as soon as any of these stories existed in the ancient world, they were being told and retold and retold. And they've pretty much been retold without stop from the very first time they were told all the way up to now. So a good retelling, I think, is like visiting an old friend, but seeing it with new eyes. And it's one of the most exciting things. So I love to read them, and I'm so excited that people have enjoyed the Song of Achilles.
Thank you. Well, getting instead to Circe, I pronounce it the Italian way.
Yes.
Yeah, Circe. Getting to Circe, your other best-selling novel. Why are we still so attracted by the witch? And what do you think is still so disruptive about the witch as an archetype? And how did Greek culture shape it?
A witch is really a woman who has an amount of power that can't be controlled by society around her. It's an amount of power that often makes the people around her uncomfortable. Women are supposed to sort of, in ancient culture and in modern culture, they're sort of supposed to stay in their area. And if they're breaking out of that area, which is what witches do, they're, seen as terrifying, they're seen as evil, or also very attractive. It's all those things. It's the breaking of boundaries. And so I think that, we've always been drawn to that, partially because I think culture tends to fear women with power, but also women, it's amazing to see a woman, do things on her own terms and be able to break out of those roles. So I love witch characters. They're some of my very favorites. And what's so wonderful about Circe is just how old this portrait is and how much we can see how she interacts with, all our ideas about witches. I mean, in the Odyssey, when we meet her, we see her surrounded by animals, by lions and wolves, this idea of sort of familiars. We see her, she has a staff that she has, kind of like a witch's wand. Now, scholars debate whether or not she's using the staff to just drive the pigs into the sty, or whether or not she's using it sort of to cast her spell. I actually think she's just using it to drive the pigs, but it's still part of that iconic kind of witch, visual of with the staff. We also see her associated with herbs and potions, with the earth, all these sort of iconic witchy things. So, but one of the things to me that's most interesting about witches is that their power is very different from gods. Gods can just snap their fingers and they make something happen. And that's exciting, but it's not that interesting. You don't have to work for it. You're born with power. Whereas witches have to earn their power. It's something that they learn how to do. And you can be better at witchcraft than another goddess or, than another witch because you have practiced it. You've practiced the spells, which herbs and when you have to gather them, how to combine them. So I love the fact that for me, witchcraft is an art. And so I see witches as artists.
It's true. And what about the shaping of the witch that comes from Greek culture?
Yes. And so what is really interesting about Circe in the Odyssey to me is that although she gets remembered as a villain, and we see her in many later versions of, the Odysseus story as a villain. I mean, she's a complete horror movie villain in the Aeneid when Aeneas just sails by the island, sort of like she's living in like a horror house there. But in the Odyssey, she's actually not a villain. That after she and Odysseus come to an understanding, she becomes one of the most helpful characters that Odysseus encounters. She sees that he and his men are exhausted and grieving. She invites them to stay on her island as long as they want to stay. When they say they want to leave, she doesn't try to keep them at all. In fact, she sends them on their way with excellent advice, with all the supplies that they need. She's the one who helps them get past the sirens. And so what's interesting about Circe is that she gets remembered as a villain, but she's actually incredibly helpful. And so what's interesting to see is how oftentimes women with power get twisted into this sort of very negative version of themselves, when in the Odyssey, she's a much more ambiguous figure. Yes, terrifying. She can turn you into a pig if she wants to, but also benevolent, healing, helpful, wise. And so in writing about her, I really wanted to go back to that sort of original portrait in all her complexity. Yes, she can be frightening, and also she can help you more than anyone else you're going to meet.
Wonderful. I got goosebumps.
Yeah,
I did. Well, book talk communities are a safe harbor for small and large communities of readers, finally able to find kindred spirits. That's what reading does. So in your opinion, how important is it for your fans and all people to keep reading the classics in such a fast-paced world?
I mean, I think I love it whenever people connect about books, any books. I think, growing up, I found my closest friends in books, and then I found my closest friends through love of books. People who loved the same books I did, or who loved completely different books, but recommended those books to me passionately. And so I think that books, whether ancient or modern, bring us together. And there's this beautiful James Baldwin quote, which I'm absolutely going to butcher. I love James Baldwin, but he says something like, you think that you're suffering, you think you're alone in the world and you're suffering, but then you read books and, you find others like you, writers speaking to what you've seen. And then, the extension of that is, and then you find other people reading those books that you can connect to. So, I love that TikTok has become such a wonderful community for people to share their passion about books and to find other people who love to read and find new recommendations and wonderful things. And it's always very exciting. I mean, I'm a Latin and Greek teacher, so I love it when people go back to the classics. But also I was raised reading at the same time that I was reading, the Aeneid and the Iliad and the Odyssey. I was reading, Toni Morrison and Isabel Allende and contemporary writers. And so I love it all. It's all wonderful.
Well, you have posted on Instagram that you are working on Persephone. This one I'm pronouncing in English. What attracted you to her, first of all?
The Persephone story is such an interesting story because usually, at least in America, it's one of the very first myths that children learn because it's the myth of the seasons. And so, you I have seen 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds learning about Persephone and Demeter and the myth of the seasons, which makes sense on some way, because that's one of the first things children notice is, oh, now it's getting colder and now it's getting warmer, and sort of understanding the seasons. But at the same time, it is an absolutely horrifying and very frightening myth about how your parent can't save you. And why it's so interesting to me that we teach that to to very young children. And I was really gripped by it as a child because I encountered it so many times. I had many versions of it. And it was always presented as sort of this light reading when it felt not light at all to me. And I always kind of kept coming back to it and coming back to it. I love underworld scenes. Anytime an ancient author describes the underworld, that was one of my favorite things to read. And I really enjoy sort of digging into depictions of the underworld. And so I've always been fascinated with this story, but I hadn't really found my way into the story because, as with any myth, you can tell it so many thousands of ways. There is many different versions of the Persephone myth as there are readers out there who are experiencing it. And in particular, the Persephone myth has been told and retold and seen so many different ways. And that core triangle of Hades, Demeter, and Persephone has been imagined in so many different ways. And so even though I loved the story and it was one that had resonated with me since I was a child, I had felt kind of like, well, there's too much about Persephone already. I don't know my way into it. I need to sort of see and then all of a sudden, I got it. I sort of saw my way in and I saw the thing that I wanted to say about it, which I'm going to be very frustrating and not talk about it. Because for me, my writing, when I'm in the middle of writing a book, it's sort of like a boiling pot. I have to keep the lid on, otherwise all the steam and heat gets out. So I will say that this is a story that has been in me for a really, really long time, since my earliest interactions with Greek myth, and I'm so excited to be writing about it.
Why do you think that Persephone is such a contemporary character? Well, generally.
Well, I think Persephone to me is so much like Helen, the figure of Helen from the Trojan War, which is that we so infrequently get their perspective, or their perspective feels so porous. It's like a kaleidoscope. Every time you turn the kaleidoscope, you get a different picture and a different picture. And ultimately, they're these very mysterious figures that we sort of don't know why they do what they do or how they feel, but they're all these, that mystery creates this sort of electric charge that we want to keep returning to. Can I understand it? Can I understand it this time? And so much like people have been drawn to Helen, I'm really drawn to the mystery of Persephone. And in writing about it, I don't think I'm trying to solve it for all time, because no retelling should do that. Every retelling should just expand the picture a little bit more. So there's no such thing as, the final version of any story. I would never want to be the final version, but I'm hoping that my Persephone can just expand the picture a little bit more.
Awesome. Well, I must ask this. Since we read that Circe is also being adapted. There was news some time ago about it being adapted to a TV series. And I would like to ask if there is any update on that.
Yes. So I'm going to have to be very careful about how I answer this, because I don't know what I'm allowed to say. I have no experience with Hollywood. I come completely from the writing side. But it was going to be with HBO Max, but when COVID hit and the pandemic, a lot of things got shuffled around and changed. So that it's not going to be with HBO Max anymore. But it is still going. There's sort of going to be a new hopefully script, working on the script for it as a mini series, and I'm excited to be involved as much as I can be. So I'm really looking forward to that. It is still moving forward, and I'm still incredibly excited about it. And I hope to have news that I can more officially say soon.
Well,
Very vague.
This was still a lot. We're very excited, really. We can't wait for the TV series. And now I will ask you some questions that come directly from the TikTok community.
Oh, wonderful.
So there's this one. In the 10 years that it took you to write the Song of Achilles, what were the most exciting moments? And I will say that I have read several interviews of yours where you said that where you were talking about your method and your lengthy time in writing.
Yes. So I think the most exciting, there were so many exciting moments. I mean, writing a novel for me is a real roller coaster. You feel like it's going well, and then you feel that it's terrible, and then you feel like it's going well, and then you feel like it's terrible again. And so that process just repeats and repeats for me. And I think that's at least very normal for me, but I think it's also normal for a lot of writers. The first time that I finished a draft, and I had this, almost 400 pages that I had worked on for 5 years. That was such a thrill. I had done it. I had really, poured my life and energy and time, and I had a finished draft. Now, that moment was incredibly exciting. It was immediately followed by the realization that the draft was bad, but it was a really exciting moment when I had the draft, because you can't make it better until you at least have the draft. The next really exciting moment for me was when I finally found Patroclus's voice. And I actually found it as I was taking a writing course and walking across campus. The first line of the novel, as it appears today, "My father was a king and the son of kings," just popped into my head. And I went racing home to my room and typed up basically the first chapter. That was thrilling. Then, of course, I was terrified because I thought, well, now what? Now I have to rewrite the whole thing. The moment when I finished the whole thing was thrilling, but also it was really sad. When I had written the very last scene and done all the edits, and I was officially turning in the manuscript, I remember sort of walking around really sad for a couple of days thinking, I've written my last Achilles and Patroclus scene. I've written the last scene of the two of them that I will ever write. And it felt like a death of sorts. And so, but also, even though I was very sad, it also felt very satisfying because I felt like I had put everything into this that I possibly could. I had made it as good as I was capable of making it. And so there was a real pride in that, that I had done the very best that I was capable of doing.
The other question is, I like this question. Why did you feel the need to write a feminist book, Circe of Circe, from the Odyssey?
Yes. So, I mean, I was raised a feminist. My mother was, fighting for equal rights the whole time I was a child. So I feel very grateful to have such a feminist mother and to have grown up that way. So when people, when I was growing up, it was not cool to be a feminist. And people would say, are you really a feminist? And I would say, yes. Isn't everyone? Shouldn't, and so there was never sort of a moment of choice. I mean, I feel like everything I write is influenced by the fact that I feel like, women should be treated fairly and that we need to listen to women's stories and treat women's lives as equally as important as men's lives. And part of writing Circe was taking a woman's story and putting her at the center of an epic, and giving her the same ability to have adventures and make mistakes and face monsters that Achilles and Odysseus have had for, millennia. And part of feminism for me is that oftentimes people see feminism as like a zero-sum game. It's like somehow if we're giving power to women, which women should have had in the first place, that we're taking away from men. And that's just completely wrong. Part of what I wanted to explore in Circe is that in a society that is oppressing 50% of its population, all the women, it's going to be way more than 50%, because men are also going to be forced into roles that they don't want. They're going to be forced to limit themselves the same way women are limiting themselves. And so one of the characters that Circe meets, who she really becomes close to, is Telemachus, Odysseus's son, who looks at sort of the classic Mycenaean hero who looks at his father's path and just sees, death and desolation and pain, and, is much more drawn to his mother and the way his mother lives. And so, feminism is good for everyone, and everything I write is feminist.
Well, I will suggest that we'll probably see some more feminism with Persephone. Maybe.
Definitely.
Yeah. What are the other question from the TikTok community is, well, this is a very large question, but you can really take some time if you like. What are your favorite books?
Oh my goodness. A weird thing about me is whenever anyone asks me this, my brain goes completely blank. Okay. I'm gonna think. There are so many books that have meant so much to me, and there are books that have sort of meant a lot to me at particular times in my life, and then, kind of cycled out. But also I love to reread and come back to books. One of the earliest books that was incredibly powerful for me was actually The Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo. I read it when I was in 8th grade. I didn't understand most of what I read. And it was in translation, and, I was very young, but I was so moved by the way he approached injustice that that was something that really, really spoke to me. So that book was an incredibly powerful book for me as I was sort of starting to come into my own and thinking about the world. I've loved the book Watership Down since I was a child. It's basically the Aeneid with rabbits. And it just goes to show that epic is an incredibly powerful genre, and you can even write an epic story with bunnies, and it still works. So that's a book that I really, really appreciate. As I got older, I fell in love with the works of Margaret Atwood. The Handmaid's Tale was an incredibly powerful awakening for me. Amy Tan, The Joy Luck Club was one of my biggest touchstones. I also love poetry. I read a lot of poetry. And I think the Aeneid is kind of at the core of everything. The Aeneid is this, at the bottom of everything is always the Aeneid. I'm really, it's one of my favorite pieces of poetry. I never get tired of revisiting it. There's so much there that I just is powerful and passionate and moving. And I feel like I really learned how to read poetry from reading the Aeneid. So that's a huge influence. More modern books, more recent books that I've read, I loved The Secret Lives of Church Ladies. That was an absolutely astounding book. I just loved it. Pachinko by Min-Jin Lee, one of my favorite books of all time. Oh my gosh, I just reread it. It's amazing. It's amazing. And that's how you know when you can reread a book and it's even better or just as amazing, it really shows you how brilliant it is. So I love that. I mentioned James Baldwin. Anytime I feel like my brain is mushy, I just read James Baldwin, and he is so smart and so thoughtful and so profound that I feel like it makes me shape up. Yes, I could go on and on, but that's some. I feel like I should mention Nora Ephron. I love Nora Ephron. She's so funny. And writing comedy is very hard, and heartburn always makes me laugh and also cry. It's a wonderful book.
That's there's some great advice for reading here too. Yes, Nora Ephron's book is incredible. Absolutely. Did you watch Pachinko's TV series on
I
Apple?
haven't watched it. I've been saving it. And I instead I just reread the book.
Yes, yes.
Have you watched it?
Yes, it was my favorite TV series from last year, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll have
It's an amazing epic, colossal, beautiful. Well, as sometimes it happens, it's different from the book, but I think you will love it.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, there is one last question from the TikTok community, which sounds a bit like something you have already said, but if you want to articulate further, we still have some time. So that would be, why does Greek mythology still speak to us today? What makes it always relevant, always alive?
I mean, I think one thing that myth does is that it allows us to blow up our emotions to be big enough to really look at them. I mean, as humans, we have huge feelings all day, every day. And I think myth gives us a container that's big enough for those huge feelings. That, you know, one of the scenes that I loved writing in Circe, Kirke, in the Greek, is I loved writing about her as a young parent. And so, you know, in my novel, this is a little bit of a spoiler, but it's okay. It's not too much. There's a god who sort of is trying to attack her child, and she's trying to protect her child from this god. And the god is much more powerful than she is. And she feels frantic and desperate, and she doesn't know what to do. And although, thankfully, most of us who have to care for a young child, who are parents or who are caregivers of a child, don't have to deal with an angry God, sometimes it can feel that way. You know, you're given this baby that is your job to protect in this world, and you're the person who has to take care of them, and you're the person that has to make sure that they thrive and love them and stand between them and all the dangers of the world. And that is a huge, epic feeling, to look down at this helpless little being and know that you are the person who's responsible for protecting them and making sure that they're okay. And so, you know, epic allows us to sort of imagine that there's a giant god attacking them and to sort of dig into that emotion, but the emotion is already there when you're doing it. Parenting is an incredibly epic endeavor, I think, or caregiving of any kind. You know, you don't have to be a parent. Any kind of caregiving is an epic endeavor because you're responsible for someone else's life. And epic is all about life and death and these powerful impulses of, you know, sometimes altruism, sometimes anger. Anyway, so I think epic and myth allows us to see things as big as they feel inside of us. I think at the same time, it also allows us to look at incredibly complex systems and feelings. I mean, one of the characters that I love from mythology, although I haven't written about her, is Cassandra. Cassandra is the Trojan princess who is cursed to tell the truth and never be believed. And in some versions of the story, she's actually assaulted by the god Apollo. And when she, you know, tries to fight him, he's the one who curses her. And the idea of women constantly trying to speak the truth and not being listened to, I mean, that is today. We are still struggling with that just as much today as we were in the ancient world. And the fact that so often sexual assault is a piece of that. It's just incredibly modern. I mean, I think every single myth you can put your finger on, and there is something there that, you know, takes us right to this moment. And I think it's really because they're so, mythology and epic are so powerfully about humanity. And you know, we're still us. So I have always felt that the myths are incredibly fresh, and it's just a question of sometimes opening them up or seeing them, allowing yourself to really see them or to see yourself in them. But it's all right there. One of my favorite things as a teacher was having students come to my class and sort of come in with this idea of, this is boring, this is old, this doesn't relate to me. And I completely understand why students might feel that way, because oftentimes classics, there's been a lot of gatekeeping around classics and sort of this idea of it's only for some people, and it's like this club that you have to join. And there's a history of white supremacy in classics that's very, very disturbing and upsetting. So I understand why students sometimes come in, or not just students, people feel alienated from these old stories. It feels like this isn't for me, or this has nothing to do with my life. But it's really exciting to sort of allow them to see, hopefully by sharing the stories with them and talking about the stories, and all of a sudden, seeing, oh my gosh, this is just about humanity, and there's so much here that I can see in my own life. And because mythology can be told in so many different ways, there isn't just one way to look at it. You can interpret it in so many different ways. You can see Demeter as the heroine, or you could see her as the villain, or you could see her anywhere in the middle of that story. Ditto with Hades, right? So any of these characters can be seen as, villainous or heroic or anywhere in between. And of course, it's the in between that's the most interesting when we're looking at those gray areas, in the way that people can be heroic and also make terrible mistakes and cause a lot of pain at the same time.
And so much conflict too. Yes. In mythology. So great writing stuff.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's also very cathartic. There's a reason why so many superhero movies are very popular right now, with all the fighting and the conflict. But so many of those comic book stories were originally influenced by the Greek myths or by the ancient myths, or not just Greek myths, the Norse myths, Thor, that they're pulling right from myths all over the world. So this is something that mythology is something that I think humans just love to dig into from all over the world. And I love it. And I love the fact that it grows with us, that it grows and it changes, and it's this living thing. It's not static. It can always be added to, and the field of vision can always be expanded.
Yes. Well, our questions are over. So, I'm very, very thankful for answering the questions from the TikTok community and my questions as well. And so, thank you very much, Madeline Miller. We're eagerly waiting for your next novel and for the TV series, and for whichever you will want to write. We will read it.
Thank you so much. This was such an honor. Thank you for your questions. Thanks to all of you from the community for your questions. I could answer them all night. So I'm so appreciative. Thank you for reading and for having me.
Thank you. Thank you, Madeline. Bye-bye.
Bye.